Okay, guys, sorry to delay you a little bit. We had some last-minute photos that we wanted to have as part of the presentation. So, first off, welcome to, if you're the first time coming here, to see Orange County Emergency Services Center. We have incredible people that do incredible stuff here. Right on the other side of this wall are 911 takers taking emergency calls right now. But what we started to do in the county is we've done podcasts for the last year, and we focused on basically your neighbors, businesses, individuals, people that have gone through struggles or maybe have done something that's something extraordinary that we wanted to highlight. But we started to move in a direction to also do something, a leadership series. Last month we had Major General Hussey, who was put in charge of Abu Ghraib, the prison that that was found to have many abuses from American soldiers. It was a big rally cry for Al Qaeda. This guy was a Cornwall resident. Today we're shifting gears, and we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine. And today I had lunch with the Orange County Sheriff, and when we left, the newspaper that was on the shelf said this. It said, "Ukraine outnumbered, outgunned in the face of a relentless Russian onslaught." On the way here, Vance, who's going to be, I'm going to introduce him in a couple minutes. There's a breaking article from Peter Bergen. It's an interview with General Petraeus. He, as well as Vance, were in Munich last weekend during a big, basically the biggest national security conference that's held annually. President Zelensky was there, obviously many of our diplomats as well as our allies around the country, around the world, talking about the status of where things are. So with that, I'd like to introduce Vance Serchuk. Vance, come on in here. How are you, my friend?
Great to see you.
All right, have a seat. I get this one, and first, thank you for coming here, Vance. You have roots in, and I showed the cover of the article of this paper that just came out actually today. Yeah. You have roots in our area. Your parents still live here. You still live here in the region. When you're not traveling, I think you're the only person that travels abroad more than I do, and you travel like 10 times more than me. But I wanted you to just tell the folks who you are. Like, where did you go to school? You have some crazy stories. I don't have 4 hours to tell how. I remember you had like a rental car. You showed up in the middle of a forward operating base in Iraq, and you met General Petraeus for the first time. And you worked with the U.S. Senate and all sorts of incredible stuff. But where'd you go to school? And let's get into that and also talk about your time living in Russia.
Yeah. So who am I? That's the question I ask myself.
Yeah.
Pretty much every day. So you're right. I grew up here in the Hudson River Valley. Ended up going to school. Did my undergrad at Princeton. Lived in Russia. I was there for what's called on a Fulbright scholarship. And I'd studied Russian language and Russian history. I was in school in the late 90s, immediately dating myself and showing how old I was. And I remember when I decided that I wanted to study the Russian language, my academic advisor, because this was the 90s and so it was sort of the end of history, said, well, if you're interested in national security, why would you study Russian? You should, that's like, if you want to sell Coca-Cola, you can study Russian language, but Russia's not a problem anymore. Everything's fine. And I thought, well, it's still actually like largest country in the world by territory, massive nuclear weapons, UN Security Council seat, history of imperialism and despotism. Maybe it's actually not such a bad thing to study. So if you're interested in national security, so that's what I did. After I lived in Russia, I then went and worked in the U.S. Senate. I worked for a senator named Joe Lieberman. I was his national security advisor. Along the way, there were a couple of youthful indiscretions, including deciding that it was a really good idea at the beginning of the Iraq War to go see it for myself. So I was working for a research group.
Before you were in the military?
Before I was in the military. So I ended up, just as you say, going into northern Iraq and spending a few weeks there. So this was part of Iraq called Iraqi Kurdistan. And I really wanted to understand for myself what was going on, how the war was unfolding. It was clear that we were having a lot of challenges. I wanted to see it for myself and see it close up. And I thought that Reading articles and watching the news is one thing, but if you are passionate about a subject, if you care about national security, there's no substitute for going to the place and actually spending time on the ground and talking to people. And so in the course of that trip, because I had gone and had this undergraduate connection to Princeton, the guy who was the commander of forces responsible for northern Iraq had a PhD from Princeton. And so I somehow managed to finagle his email address. And I sent him an email from like an internet cafe. And he said, yeah, by all means, come by my palace. And that was then Major General Dave Petraeus. And in the end, we got to know each other quite well. I was an advocate in Washington for a change in strategy in Iraq, which ultimately got expressed in this thing called the Surge, which then four-star General Dave Petraeus was put in charge of. And there was a huge fight in Congress at the time, and I was working for Senator Lieberman, and Senator Lieberman together with Senator McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham were sort of the three people most advocating for it. And then for the last decade, I've done two things. The first is, as you know, like you, been in the Navy Reserve. As an intelligence officer, so I'm a lieutenant commander in the Reserve, and have been privileged to work on a number of really interesting, I think important issues, from naval special warfare to where I am now, which is assigned to the Pacific Fleet. I think I'm probably one of the few people who comes back from Hawaii even paler than I was when I go out there, because I spend all my time sort of in a basement doing intelligence stuff, which is a lot less fun than Waikiki.
You picked the wrong designator.
Yeah, I definitely, well, I hear stories from you, and I sort of reflect on just generally a lot of very poor life choices. And then the second is that I work actually with General Petraeus, speaking of other people who are from the region, at a firm called KKR. And so it's a large global investment firm. And he is the chairman, and I'm the executive director of what's called the KKR Global Institute, which does the geopolitics for the firm. But I continue to, like Dave, be very involved in sort of national security debates, and the question of Russia, which has now also become inextricably bound up in the question of Ukraine, is one that was probably the common thread throughout my career, from my learning the language to living there a long time ago, to working on Russia when I was on Capitol Hill. Ironically at the time, I'd like to say that I was probably part of the small group of folks who were pretty worried about Vladimir Putin before it was the cool thing to do. When actually, if anything, the dominant sentiment in Washington was we can get along with this guy, and actually, why are you making such a fuss? Because we need to have a good relationship, and he might have some strange tendencies, and there might be some odd things going on in Russia, but fundamentally this is okay. As I think President Bush, who looked him in the eye and saw his soul, and then President Obama, who did the reset, and when was criticized by then Governor Romney, was sort of said, well, the 1980s call, they want your foreign policy back. So Russia is a big deal. And Russia has been a common thread through it all.
So I've known you for a while now. Alan Mack and I think met you together.
Yeah.
It was basically a luncheon filled with former ambassadors in New York City.
Yeah, I don't know why we let you in.
I don't know either yet. I think Alan Mack and I were the only members of the military that were not diplomats there. But we were basically talking about our experiences in the Middle East, and terrorism was winding down. Yeah. And over the last couple of years, in recent years, you and I have both been assigned predominantly to the Pacific Fleet. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in Hawaii in March of 2022 when I got a phone call that said, you and 200,000 American troops are going to be going to Europe now. The Russians have invaded. So we went there. I was there for a year. We put a ton of supplies to Ukraine. They seem to be holding, when I left the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said to our group, by the time you get to Ukraine, it'll be a puppet state of Russia they will not hold. Yeah. So the Ukrainian military and the people itself shocked the world by being able to not only survive, but repel in many instances. And now where we are today. And again, I've known you for a long time, but I've never seen you as emotionally and impassioned as you are now. And we've been talking about China, counterterrorism. You and I both deployed around the same time with the Special Forces. Yeah. And we've talked about China and Taiwan, and now we have Israel and Gaza, all that going on today as we sit here. But you were very emotional when you came back here in the last week, and that's why we wanted to put this on. We thought it was important. It's headlines, obviously, in the news, and there's controversy. So I just wanted to ask you, you were in Munich last week. Well, you were in Ukraine first.
I was in Ukraine first, yeah.
So,
I was in Ukraine for just over a week.
So,
and then I was in Munich for the security conference, which, as you correctly said, I mean, it's sort of like, it's like Burning Man for defense.
Yeah.
You know, it's this sort of, it's actually a fascinating conference. So, and the evolution of the conference itself is like a really interesting story. So this conference was created back in the early 1960s by a guy named Ewald von Kleist, who was a German military officer who was the youngest member of the plot, the conspiracy to assassinate Adolf Hitler. So if you guys, there's
and he survived,
that Kenneth Branagh movie. He was going to be the suicide bomber. And his job, he was a kid, he was 17, 18 years old. His job was to take out Hitler. The plot, as you've seen the movie, the plot got detected, and he came from a very aristocratic Prussian family. And he actually talked to and I had the chance to meet him while he was still alive. This was now 15 years ago. And he actually went to his father, can you imagine this? And was wrestling with the decision of what do I do? And his father told him, if you don't do this, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Can you imagine having this conversation with your son? So after the war, he miraculously survived. He was sent to the Eastern Front to die. The war ended before he died. He managed to kind of slip through the cracks of the Third Reich. And he said, you know, what am I going to do with my life? And he decided that he wanted to create a conference, a gathering, to bring together the good guys, right? And the principle that we need to make sure that something like this never happens again. How are we going to do that? By having the Western democracies, the leaders of the Western democracies, come together in one place for a weekend and talk about the common problems of how do we defend ourselves? How do we deter the dictators so that we don't have to have another world war? How do we keep the dictators at bay? Now, early 1960s, this is the height of the Cold War. So, you know, Germany is divided in half. So this is West Germany. But the idea was, okay, let's bring together the Americans, the Canadians, West Germans, French, British, the good guys. And so this was the idea behind the conference. It began very small. It was people like Henry Kissinger who were sort of present there at the creation. The conference evolved over many years. It got bigger and bigger as the West got bigger and bigger, as the wall came down. As countries that had been on the other side of the Berlin Wall, that had been communist states, escaped from that Soviet empire, became democracies, became capitalist societies, and joined this extraordinary alliance. It also, consistent with the end of history thesis, they started saying, well, let's also invite the Russians because they're on a transition to democracy. Let's maybe invite the Iranians because they might not be the nicest people, but we should have a dialogue with them, blah, blah, blah. And so that's how the conference evolved. What has happened now is something really interesting, which is that it is once again confronting a very old question, which is how do we defend ourselves? And unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the end of the Cold War, when there was this sense that, well, we now have peace, and of course, democracy is spreading everywhere, and sure, yes, after 9/11, we have problems with terrorists and extremists who lurk in these kind of collapsed corners of the world. But of course, we don't really have to worry about the kinds of problems we did in the 20th century, which was big, powerful states that build up the instruments of war and then threaten to use them or use them to try to redraw the map. That's done. Well, guess again. And unfortunately, during this period, the Europeans, but also the Americans, in fact, all of us, significantly disarmed ourselves. We didn't keep up. So at the same time that our friends in Russia and China have significantly increased their defense spending, have modernized their militaries, all with an eye towards being able to remake the world along the lines that they would like. We have, unfortunately, gone in a different direction. And so this conference this past weekend was very interesting because it was a lot of people, foremost our allies in Europe, saying, okay, Ukraine is the wake-up call. We live in a dangerous world. We live in a world where we have a dictator on our doorstep, and if he succeeds in Ukraine, he's not going to stop in Ukraine. And so therefore, we need to get our act together. Now, that's also a conversation that we've got to have here in this country. And you're right, Steve, I came back from my time in Ukraine. We can talk about what I got to see in Ukraine and traveled all across the country, because we're at a critical moment. You know, this marks 2 years since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It's been 10 years since the war began. This was back in 2014 that Putin first moved into Ukraine, took Crimea, and also moved into eastern Ukraine and really starting that war. But now we also have a debate. And we're doing exactly what Americans, in my view, should do as a democracy and as a country of 320 million people. We disagree on things, which is that we're having the argument about, well, what should our role be? And in particular, right now in Congress, the question of should we, as a country, make another commitment of military support for the Ukrainians, which really means being able to invest in our own defense industrial base and then enabling the production of weapons, which will go to the Ukrainians. And that's the debate that we're having, and we are at the decision point for that. And the consequences, in my view, we talk about it, are going to be very, very far-reaching depending on how we as a society, we as a country, we as a democracy answer that question.
So the Russians have lost about 300,000 people, dead or wounded, in the last 2 years. 300,000.
Yeah, they've lost more in Ukraine in 2 years than they lost in Afghanistan back in the 1980s in a decade. However, and there's a big however to this, if you are a society where you got to go before your people and you're subject to a midterm election or a real presidential election, and that happens, that's a big deal. But that's not Russia under Vladimir Putin. So the fact that this war has resulted in unbelievable carnage for the Russian people is not going to be something which deters him. Moreover, Russia has a demographic advantage over Ukraine, right? Russia's population is a lot bigger, and Russia is also then able to draw and throw people, criminals, people that they pull off of the street, people from other countries that they recruit with money into this meat grinder. At the same time, Russia's done something else, which is that for the first time since the end of the Cold War, Russia is spending more on its military, about 7-8% of GDP, than they are on social programs. So they have ramped to a war economy, and they are mass producing munitions, artillery. They also have massive stockpiles that are left over from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was a gigantic weapons depot.
And Iran and North Korea have also chipped in with weapons.
More than chipped in, right? So they also have allies. The North Koreans are giving them missiles and artillery. The Iranians are giving them drones, which they are also then using against Ukraine. So unfortunately, while the Russians have lost a lot of people, they have also mobilized. And in general, and this is, I think, something which goes straight to Russian history, right? If Vladimir Putin were here, and if he had been here at any point in the last 2 years, and you said, well, this doesn't look so good. You know, this looks like a real mess. And you've lost all these people, you've lost all this equipment. What's going on? He would say, let's talk about how Russia wins. So Russia doesn't win by outsmarting its adversaries. It wins by outsuffering them. It wins by enduring. And he would say, well, this is how we dealt with Napoleon. This is how we dealt with the Nazis, right? This is how we endure. And we will therefore be able to outsuffer. Now, not a bad argument when you look at Russian history. And more recently, he would point to places where he's been able to prevail, like Chechnya, where they inflicted unbelievable violence against a part of their own country. He'd point to Syria, which they carpet bombed. They carpet bombed Aleppo, one of the oldest cities in the world. And so that combination of a complete disregard for the lives of your own people and a willingness to inflict the most spectacular violence you can imagine, indiscriminately, on civilians, there you have it, the Russian way of war. Now, the one thing, though, which is also in his mind, and it's a reason that he can't back down, is that he also knows something else, which is that throughout Russian history, military debacles usually lead to some sort of political upheaval at home. So, you know, the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War, when the Russians got clobbered by the Japanese, first time that a non-Western military defeated a Western. We'll put Western also a little bit in quotes for that one, but a Western military, they got clobbered, and then you get the 1905 revolution, which is a near-death experience for the Romanovs, for the czars who were ruling Russia. Then you get World War I, and World War I is a debacle for the Russian army, and the Russian army collapses. And you end up with an uprising in what is today Petersburg, what then was called Petrograd, what would then become Leningrad, and you have the end of that 300-year Romanov dynasty. You have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, thanks to the fact that archival materials have now opened up, we know a lot more, not just about what happened in Washington, but what was going on in Moscow during that Cuban Missile Crisis, and how Khrushchev blundered his way into Cuba, not really knowing what he was doing, and then blundered his way out. And then not very long after that, Khrushchev was not there anymore, right? Khrushchev got removed, the only Soviet leader to get removed from the top job. And then we have Afghanistan, right? In the 1980s, another military debacle. And not so long after Afghanistan, there was the Soviet unraveling, that Soviet collapse. So this is a big deal for him.
He
right?
sees the writing on the wall.
So there's no way out for him except this Russian way of war, which he believes is going to win. Now, the good news is that we've got a couple things that are going on our side. So the first is, you mentioned this before, so 2 years ago, there was an extraordinary intelligence success on our side and also an extraordinary intelligence failure, right? So what was that success? That success was that the US intelligence community was able to accurately predict that Putin was going for a full-scale invasion. Now, when this began to circulate in the fall of 2021, most people, including the Ukrainian government itself and the governments of many of our closest allies in Europe, were very skeptical. If you went and you talked to German intelligence, if you went and you talked to French intelligence at the highest levels, they were saying, there go the Americans again. You remember those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? I wouldn't buy it. But, there they go again. In fact, French and German intelligence were telling their own leadership, he's not going to do it. But not only was American intelligence saying he's going to do it, but they started selectively declassifying things and putting it out in public that this is for real. He's going to do it. So when he made his move, and this is also something which is remarkable, and it tells you a lot about the nature of the Putin regime. When he made that move exactly 2 years ago, when those Russian forces began to roll into Ukraine, the US intelligence community was not surprised. However, mid-level people in the Russian Defense Ministry were very surprised. Because not only was he lying to the world and saying, oh, I'm not going to go in, he had also kept much of his own bureaucracy in the dark about what was actually going on. So Russians themselves were also shocked, including inside the security apparatus. So that was an extraordinary intelligence success. And let's talk about the failure. So in the weeks before, the expectation was exactly what you said, Steve. How long can the Ukrainians hold out against this onslaught? Not long. Not long. This thing is going to collapse because the Russians have such extraordinary material superiority. And so it's very sad, but Ukraine is going to be lost. At least much of Ukraine is going to be lost.
Which, by the way,
Kiev's going to fall.
The invading Russians had parade uniforms.
That's right.
Which you and I probably never bought overseas because they were so confident that they would be marching in the streets of Kiev as victories.
So this is the difference between Steve and me. I bring my parade uniform with me wherever I go.
Yeah.
Just because you got to be ready, just in case. You never know when there's going to be a parade.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's how confident the Russians were.
Yeah, not only did they have the uniforms, senior people had picked out the apartments in Kiev that they were going to move into. So that was the attitude. They thought that this thing was going to be, to use a phrase from another war, a cakewalk. But the Ukrainians surprised everyone. And in fact, the Ukrainian resistance was unbelievable. And they managed through extraordinary courage and grit and perseverance, and also with a lot of help, increasing help from the West in weapons, intelligence, to thwart what had been the original Putin plan, which was to seize control of the entire country, to take the capital, to capture and kill the leadership, the democratically elected leadership of Ukraine, to crush it. Now, they got very far. If we want to pull up the map for a second.
Yeah.
You can go to that first slide, and you can see the yellow on that map is where the Russians were able to reach in 2022. So they were able to push all the way to the edge of Kyiv. They were able to push very, very far. Now the dark red is additional territory that they seized. The difference between the red and the yellow is territory that the Ukrainians were able to push them back out of. Right? So it's not just that the Russians rolled in, it's also that the Ukrainians managed not only to stop them, but then also to reverse. So about 20% of their territory that the Russians took, the Russians got pushed out of. Now, while the Russians were in that territory, they did unspeakable things. So when I was there 2 weeks ago, one of the places that I went, which is a place which I think is going to be one of those names that people are going to know throughout history, is called Bucha. So Bucha is a suburb of Kyiv. It's actually not so different from actually towns right around here. Right? This is a place that people in Kyiv would commute from to get into the city. It's a kind of a nice leafy suburb. Some people, might have a house up there so that they can have a bit more space, rather than in the apartments that you can only have in the city, right? Sound familiar? So Russian forces reached there. This was basically the edge of as far as they were able to go. They occupied it for a period of time, and they massacred people. And one of the sites that we visited was one of the mass graves that they found after the Russians pulled back, which had over 200 bodies in it. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was over 100, right? And these were civilians. These were not, to state the obvious, there aren't a lot of 4-year-old soldiers. There aren't a lot of, 100-year-old soldiers. So these were civilians, men and women, that they just massacred over the course of their time there. And they massacred people because they were getting frustrated about the fact that they were getting picked off, that they were getting shot at, but they turned against the population. But the Ukrainians fought back ferociously, and as a result, while the Russians have been able to expand their reach from 2014, and you can see on that map the territory that they took from in 2014, which is that light pink, Crimean Peninsula, parts of eastern Ukraine. So they've been able to expand and be able to take more of eastern Ukraine and build that land bridge that connects the territory that they had back in 2014 that they seized with Crimea. So they still have all of that. But the Ukrainian success has been absolutely remarkable. And they continue, for all that this war has been horrible and exhausting and terrible, the will to continue to fight is there. And what I heard from people all across the country, and in the course of this trip, we actually came in from Moldova, which you can see in the southwest. We drove to Odessa, which is one of those great ancient cities on the port, which the Russians tried to take in 2014 unsuccessfully. We went from Odessa to a place you can see up there called Kryvyi Rih, which was President Zelensky's hometown. From there, we went to a place called Dnipro, and then up, and you can see in the northeast, a city called Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. It is right on the line, and in fact was a city that the Russians were able to take, and then they got pushed back out of in late 2022, before then going to Kyiv. In all of these places, and this was not just meetings with people from government, this was meetings with regular people, people who had lost their homes, people who had lost loved ones, people who had lost pets. This is something that actually so many people in Ukraine talked about, the fact that when the war happened, their dog ran away, or their cat died because of from the fear from the shelling. And people talked obviously with great emotion about it. I mean, you can all imagine this. This is a middle-class country. It's a European country, right? The kinds of things that you would imagine if suddenly, our homes came under this kind of attack. What would you do? Everyone said, look, we don't have a choice. Because the issue here is not, is the political orientation of Ukraine. NATO, not NATO, EU, not EU. It's not about Ukraine's allegiance. It's about Ukraine's existence. And Vladimir Putin, to be fair, has been remarkably consistent. As early as 2005, in meetings with leader after leader, when the question of Ukraine comes up, he'll say, well, it's not a real country. They don't deserve to exist.
He kind of said it in the Tucker Carlson interview, too.
Yeah, so the Tucker interview, if you've watched and read Putin, there was not a lot new in that. Putin has been saying variations of this for some time. In the summer of 2021, he published a 6,000-word essay on the Kremlin website, which you can still download and read, and it's in Russian, it's in English, which is basically a lot like in the Tucker interview, this long argument about Russian history. The punchline of which is, Russia got robbed, all this belongs to us, there is no Ukrainian people, and therefore we're entitled to this empire, and therefore we're gonna take it. So that's what is at the root of this. I will also say, though, if you keep reading and keep watching and keep listening to Putin, you quickly realize something else, which is, and for that matter, if you look at Russian history. First is that anyone who tells you, okay, well, look, it's a tough world, and America's got lots of problems here, and we do, and we got other challenges. Talked about China, you talk about the Middle East. Let's therefore, why do we care?
Well, I was going to ask you that. You had Republican and Democratic members of Congress and Senate in Munich with you.
Yes, we did.
And they're coming back to talk to my residents here and the residents and Americans around the country.
Yes, they did.
We're talking about 300,000 wounded, dead Russians, but they're continuing to get rearmed within themselves or by Iran and North Korea. You have now more of them coming in. What's the end game here? Why should America continue to basically lead the effort to fund that war effort and support the Ukrainians?
Yeah, because when Russia is on the march, it won't stop until they hit steel. This was the old Lenin line. Lenin's direction was, if you hit steel, stop. If you hit mush, push. Vladimir Putin's grievance is not just with Ukraine. It's about the entire post-Cold War settlement. And his grievance is first and foremost with America and American power. And as long as America is that shining city on the hill, as long as America is strong and successful, he's got a big problem. So, like a classic predator, he searches for what he thinks is going to be the weakest member of the herd, which he'll take down first. Who did he go after first? He went after his own people. Right? The first thing that he did after coming to power was he started to systematically go after the journalists, to go after the opposition, to kill people in mysterious circumstances. So he's killed. And by the way, when you look at what he's done to his own people like Alexei Navalny, who was just murdered, we think, a few days ago, when you look at what he's done to Russians, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, if you're prepared to do that to your own people, what do you think he's prepared to do to the rest of us? What do you think he's prepared to do to Americans? So that grievance is with American power. So we got a choice. Either we can throw our weight and our support, not our troops, but our weapons, behind the Ukrainians and back them so that they in turn can bleed Putin and his forces white and exhaust them and bog them down and hold the line, or we can abandon them. If we abandon them, he's not going to stop at Ukraine. Now, some people say, well, look, we caused this because we, made Putin feel unsafe, because we talked about Ukraine and NATO, and we expanded NATO, and so that's why he's being aggressive. So I understand this argument. In a way, it's actually it's an argument which I think stems from a kind of American idealism, which is that we want to believe that if there's a conflict, it must be a misunderstanding. It must be because we made a mistake, because people of goodwill should be able to get along. But I think it's really profoundly wrong on a couple of levels. First, just as a matter of history, in 2014, when he first went into Ukraine, NATO membership was not on the table, it wasn't under the table, it was not in the room. No one was talking about NATO for Ukraine, nor for that matter in 2022. So NATO in Ukraine was something which never had anything to do with anything. But two, when people say we should give Ukraine, parts of Ukraine to Putin so that he feels sated, so that he can feel safe.
The exit ramp.
Yeah. So here's my question. What you're really saying is we got to make Putin feel safe. And my question is, okay, well, what will it take to make someone like Vladimir Putin, who's killed his way to the top, who is built a dictatorship on murder and corruption and lies, what will it take to make someone like that feel safe? So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union had Ukraine. And they didn't just have Ukraine. They had the Baltic states, they had Poland, they had Czechoslovakia, they had Hungary, they had half of Germany, and yet they wanted more. That's why we had to create NATO in the first place. Because in the absence of creating NATO in 1949, they were preparing to push for even more. So Russia today has 11 time zones. Apparently that's not enough to feel safe. So the argument, I guess, is if you give them a 12th, that's going to turn the tide? I don't think so. Moreover, the phenomenon of Russian expansionism, Russian imperialism, is something which has been going on for hundreds of years, long before NATO comes along. So it's a weird argument when you think about it that says, well, the reason the Russians are now being expansionist and aggressive is because we provoked them with NATO, when the problem, the geopolitical problem of Russian expansionism, has been something that predates NATO for literally centuries, and that in fact, the one thing which has actually been successful in checking it, in deterring it, was the creation of that alliance. Because the one thing that Putin has not done has been to militarily attack a member of NATO. He uses gray zone tactics, he does cyber, he tries various other kinds of skullduggery, he'll send his assassins to try to kill people, murder people. But the direct military attack is for countries that are not in the alliance. It's against places like Georgia, which, by the way, he invaded in 2008. It's against Ukraine. So I think that gets it exactly wrong. The most important thing, though, is to recognize this is someone whose grievance, this is someone who said that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, personally, I look at the 20th century and I'd say I think that there were much bigger geopolitical catastrophes. World War II, the Holocaust, there are a couple of pretty solid nominees for the worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Vladimir Putin says, no, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is someone who's got a vendetta against us, about America, about America's role in the world, about a world where democracies, free market democracies, are strong and united. That's the issue. Ukraine is simply where he sees opportunity right now. If we allow him to succeed there, it does not end there. That is also one of those lessons of history.
Vance, I want to talk just real quick about the Russian people, and then we're going to start taking some questions from the audience. Like the Iraqi people that I've dealt with and people all over the world I've met are all good people, in my opinion. They, besides the terrorists and the bad guys that were pushing them, most people I've ever encountered are the same people like us. They want to raise their families, they want to be successful, they want to live, and they want to leave their children with a better world. The Russian people, 85% of them in a recent poll, blamed the Americans for killing the 300,000 or wounding Russians rather than the Ukrainian people. That scares me for people in this room that have kids in the army, grandkids are going to join the military, because they're going to want that pound of flesh back. Is there, you said that you articulated a couple examples of where if the Russians screwed up, this usually triggers a regime change. If there's a Russia without Putin, because I don't think anybody expects him to retire somewhere in the Black Sea in a nice resort.
I don't think he's going to Boca.
No, he's either going to be in a trunk somewhere or he'll stay. What is a post-Putin Russia if they're able to hold the line in Ukraine?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is I probably would not be a big, too overly trusting in Russian polls. Because, when a pollster contacts you in Russia and says, how do you feel about Vladimir Putin?
He's the best.
I think that it's pretty clear what the answer is supposed to be. Now, we have some anecdotal evidence, but which I think is very important. So the first is, what has been one of the consequences of this war? So Steve talked about all the Russians who have been tragically killed and maimed because they were sent into this meat grinder. What we've also had has been an extraordinary exodus of Russians who are trying to get out of Russia. And in particular, these are the kinds of people who, if you want your country to have a future, you don't want to lose. These are people who work in computer science and IT. These are the upwardly mobile professionals. These were the people who, in the 1990s and the 2000s, really believed in this idea of Russia changing and who thought, okay, we're going to now be a more European country with rule of law. By the way, these were people like Alexei Navalny, who did not begin as some sort of anti-government zealot. Navalny was a lawyer, and he began with a very simple idea, which is that he said, all these people are complaining about corruption. Our own government at the time is complaining about corruption and the fact that we lose billions and billions and billions of dollars every year to corruption. Corruption is this plague in Russia. So he said, well, I'm going to create a blog. And all I'm going to say is, if you have evidence of corruption, you send it to me. And people started doing that. They started sending, documents that they had, taken a photo of with their phone that were showing how, the government was stealing on a massive scale. And it wasn't, it was actually a lot of examples of local government, right? It would be the equivalent of towns and counties and states, the $100 million contract for lunches at your kid's cafeteria, only the kids are being served dog food. So you say, well, what's going on here? That was what Navalny started to do. And what Putin's response to that was, well, this is a threat to me. I'm going after this because there cannot be any kind of criticism of the state. And, oh, by the way, no one's stealing more than I am, which is at the absolute heart of that regime, right? All the money that he and his cronies have stolen. So a lot of those people who were in that professional class have fled. There is actually an incredibly successful Russian Silicon Valley. It's called Tel Aviv. So you go to Israel and you find that a lot of the IT sector in Israel, which is spectacular, cyber, is people who have fled from Russia. So they got a huge problem in that respect, long term. You ask a profound question, though, which is, is Russia the way that Russia is because of Putin? Or is Putin the way that Putin is because of Russia? So my answer is it's a little bit of both. I think that it's not a total fluke that we ended up with someone like Putin. Not because the Russians, my own background, if you see my last name, is from that part of the world. I don't think that I'm genetically predisposed towards despotism. Some members of my family might disagree, but I think for the most part that's not true, right? So the argument that there's some sort of reason that Russia is just doomed to have a certain kind of politics because the Russians are the way that they are, I don't think that that's particularly compelling, because Russians leave Russia and they don't then try to invade Poland. What I do think, however, we've got is two things. One, there is an institutional inheritance from the Soviet Union. What was the Soviet Union? It was a massive, illiberal regime where you had an executive branch that was out of control and was not accountable to anyone, including itself, and a massive and sprawling set of security agencies. So Putin comes from one of those security agencies, the KGB. So one of the legacies of the Soviet Union was that you had all of these people running around who were ex-KGB, ex-other kinds of security services, and the likelihood that there was going to be some sort of, as a result of that inheritance, some sort of reconstitution around those people, I think was always, unfortunately, more likely than that you were going to get some sort of rule of law, separation of powers, Western-style democracy. It's one. Two, what does it mean for the future. So we would all, I think, like to believe that there could be a future for Russia which is very different from what we're dealing with right now. I think we got to be realistic that we don't have that magic wand, right? We don't have that ability as the United States to be able to dictate the internal political evolution of Russia. However, just as you said, just as we've discussed, nothing succeeds like success and nothing fails like failure. And there are Russians, Navalny was one of them, who want to see a different kind of Russia. There are also, and this is when I think it gets even more interesting, and this is perhaps less optimistic, more realistic, in my view. There are people within that regime who are not nice people. These are not people who believe in democracy and rule of law. These are not people who, if you ask them and you said, well, do you think Ukraine belongs to you? They'd say yes. Do you want a Russian empire? Yes, absolutely I do, and I think I deserve it as well. But there are also people who can look out, and if they see failure, will say, I think that Putin got us into a bad place. And it's a place where rather than strengthening Russia, he ended up weakening Russia. And so maybe we need to recalibrate. So, you can imagine we all have ambitions, desires, for ourselves. But we also know what happens if you live beyond your means. So I do okay. But if I try to go buy a $20 million house, that's probably not going to go so well for me, right? I might be able to for, I don't know, if I can fool the bank, but pretty soon there's going to be a bankruptcy. Pretty soon there's going to be a pretty ruinous result, right? If there's going to be a path out, my belief is going to be not just when it's the people who share our values inside Russia, but the people within that regime who are from the security services, who are very, very hostile to us in a lot of ways, but who are going to look and say, we're living beyond our means, and the result is that we're now courting bankruptcy, and therefore we have to change course. And Putin, you really drove the car into a ditch, and we gotta recalibrate. That, I think, is something which is conceivable in the event that we're able to provide the support that the Ukrainians need. And by the way, we can talk a lot more about, of all the things, we can talk a lot more about what's happening inside Ukraine, from the military particularities, but if we can have a military defeat for them there, which, by the way, can be defined simply as not
losing
winning on the Russian side, and the Ukrainians not losing. Holding those lines can be a long-term success. Just as, by the way, in Korea, in Korea, we ultimately just held the line. So there's North Korea and there's South Korea. And we keep South Korea safe, and South Korea is an extraordinary success story.
We talked about the 300,000 Russians, but there's hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that were killed and wounded, and civilians.
Yes.
And like you said, you could relate to any downtown American, city getting hit with hypersonic missiles by the Russians. Is there a pathway, even though they're on the National and the UN Security Council, to hold these people accountable? And the second part of it is there's some veterans in this room that would never commit the atrocities that those troops did. Is it conventional troops? Is it the Wagner Group? Is it a little bit of everything?
It is unfortunately all of the above. Yeah, it's not just the Wagner guys who, in many cases, were just pulled from prisons. This was also the Russian military. By the way, the war crimes don't just involve killing people and torturing people. They've also kidnapped tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. Which is, unbelievable. Can you imagine this? Taking kids, bringing them back to Russia, and telling them that you're Russian now. This is the kinds of things that they've been doing. So this is really profound in how sinister it is. Look, there's a lot of complexity in the world. We both do. National security, foreign policy, we appreciate that there are shades of gray. We appreciate that there's always many sides to any story, but sophistication, intellectual sophistication, in my view, is not just about being able to see complexity. It's also sometimes being able to distill complexity and not into simplicity. And there is, at the end of the day, for all the complexity of the situation, there is right and wrong. This is as close as you get to pure wrong, pure evil, as you're going to find, in my view, on this planet right now. The question that you ask, though, about can there be accountability? There's not going to be accountability as a result of some vote at the UN or because some international criminal court makes a judgment. One of the other lessons of Ukraine, which is a tough lesson for people in the West to, I think, internalize, is that hard power really matters. When you're dealing with Vladimir Putin, international law, economic sanctions, all those things, they're fine, they're important, but what really counts is, do you have the ability to turn them back on the battlefield? If you don't, none of that other stuff is going to make much of a difference. And as I said, look, one of the other hopeful things is that the Ukrainians had a huge success last year on the military sphere. They had a huge military failure, which was that, as a result of weapons that we gave them, the hope was that they were going to be able to have a counteroffensive on land and break that land bridge between eastern Ukraine and Crimea, that bright red block that you can see on the bottom of the screen. That did not succeed. And we can talk about why. But they also had a great success, which was in the Black Sea, which is that they cleared the western half of the Black Sea of the Russian Navy, despite not having a navy of their own. How did they do that? They did that with drones, and they did that with long-range missiles, which they developed themselves. So for everyone who also says, well, I feel for the Ukrainians, but we can't do another forever war. We can't just support these people indefinitely. How long is this going to go on? Ukraine has a defense industry. It's actually one of the inheritances that they got from the Soviet Union, because it's actually sort of one of the places where the Soviets had major defense industry, and they are innovating. In many ways, the things that they have developed are exactly the technologies that we in the United States are going to need if we're going to keep China at bay across the Taiwan Strait. So Ukraine's defense innovation, and they are working ferociously on this, means first that, in my view, what we need to do is buy some time and space for the Ukrainians by helping them. But in the long run, they're going to be able to have a lot of defense capability that they're going to be building for themselves, and which ultimately may also end up helping us against some of the challenges that we have because of the technologies that they're mastering.
In the interest of time, I just want to hand one more question for you, and then we'll just go through your photos you have here. The disastrous exodus of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Many leaders on both sides say that if that didn't happen that way, Putin would not have had the chutzpah to cross into Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do you want to comment on that?
Chutzpah being an old Russian word. Yeah. No.
I'm playing up to your background here.
Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate that. So I'm going to say something that when you're on stage you're not supposed to say, and which people in politics definitely are not supposed to say. I don't know. I don't think we know. So, there's the argument which on some level intuitively makes sense, right? The fiasco that took place in Afghanistan in the summer of 2021. Did that feed into it? Maybe. It certainly makes sense on some level. The flip side is he wrote that article on the Kremlin website in June of 2021. And that article was I'm going in. That was a Mein Kampf kind of thing. He declared, "This is what I'm doing," right?
Much like the president of China did last year, saying, "I'm taking Taiwan
Yeah,
the next 5 years."
So one of the other lessons from history, which I think we always have to relearn, is take people seriously at their word, particularly dictators. Osama bin Laden declared war on us in 1996. We just didn't notice until about 5 years later. Vladimir Putin could not have been clearer about his intentions on Ukraine. We know other experiences and examples as well. And by the way, during the Cold War, you look at our successful strategy, and what was our strategy during the Cold War, right? It was containment. And you go back and you read the text that George Kennan, the father of containment, wrote, Sources of Soviet Conduct, which was initially a long telegram that he wrote back when he was acting ambassador in Moscow, and then it becomes an article that he published. His analysis, which provided the basis for successful strategy, began with his close reading of what the Soviet leadership itself was saying. And the Soviets, in contrast to Putin, in contrast to bin Laden, in contrast to Hitler, and in contrast, I fear, to Xi, the Soviets said time is on our side because they were communists. And their view was, there's a dialectic and there's a historical inevitability to our triumph. And so therefore, we can bide our time because we know that inevitably the world is going to go in our direction. If we see opportunities, we're going to grab them. But if we encounter resistance, we also can wait. We can be patient. And so, Kennan's argument was, well, okay, therefore we're not dealing with another Hitler. We don't have to have a preemptive war. We can simply contain them. And that proved to be a brilliant strategy and a successful strategy. So I think that we got to recognize, and I guess one last point on this. If we're going to talk about, let's assign some blame, right? I think we can talk about responsibility. My personal view is that over 20 years, presidents, administrations of both parties did a great deal to convince Vladimir Putin that he could literally get away with murder. That was not, one administration.
Line in the sand.
That was multiple administrations where Putin began very cautiously. He began by saying, okay, well, I'm going to go after, as I said before, journalists. I'm going to go after the political opposition. I'm going to go after businessmen I don't like. Putin came to power initially as prime minister in 1999. Just after he became prime minister, he'd been head of the FSB, which was the successor agency to the KGB. Just after he became prime minister, there was an apartment blast in Moscow, a terrorist bombing, which killed a very large number of people. And Putin immediately blamed it on Chechen terrorists, and it became the basis for Russia launching a second Chechen war. There had been a previous attempt to subdue Chechnya back in the mid-1990s before Putin came around. Almost immediately, a lot of evidence began to surface that implicated the FSB, the Russian security services, in that bombing. At the same time that this took place, another bomb was found at a different building. FSB agents were planting it. They were arrested. The FSB subsequently came out and said, no, this was just a coincidence, blah, blah, blah. Everyone who investigated this in Russia died of a mysterious death. People fell out of windows, people got mysterious diseases that couldn't be diagnosed and dropped dead. So he began by going after, and what was our response? Nothing. Nothing. And then, we start to see action against neighbors. In 2007, there's a massive cyber attack on Estonia. It's the first time we see a cyber attack on that scale. Estonia, which former Soviet republic, independent country now, member of NATO by that point, and a country which has always been ahead of its time in embracing the internet and digitalization. I remember being there in 2002, and people were paying with things with their flip phones and thinking, oh, cool, this is what the future is going to look like. So they do this massive cyber attack. What do? 2008, he invades Georgia. What do? We declare a reset, right? And we can go on and on. So I think that part of the reason that we're here, Steve, if we're going to be really honest, is it would be nice to be able to point it at one president or one screw up, one mistake. But I think that and by the way, when you look back and you talk to people who were involved in these decisions and you say, wasn't this a mistake? Shouldn't we have been tougher, including in 2014? Remember, he goes into Ukraine in 2014, and for 2 years, President Obama doesn't provide any weapons to the Ukrainians. We provide them with meals ready to eat. We provide them with some Kevlar. We don't provide them with real weapons. We don't provide them with anti-tank. A lot of people who are in government today will privately say, yeah, we got it wrong. They will also say, we were so emotionally invested in this idea that Russia was ultimately going to come over to our side. We were so emotionally invested in this idea that the Cold War was over. And the idea that we could be back again dealing with something so dangerous, so despotic, we just didn't want to see it. And in our failure to confront Putin earlier, we invited even worse, even more dangerous confrontations. To my mind, that's also the history we should keep in mind right now when there are people who show up and say, we shouldn't get involved in this thing. This is someone else's problem. We can have a great relationship with Putin. He's got legitimate grievances. You guys, we all know what this narrative sounds like. I think that is a profound miscalculation, not on the basis simply of morality, but on the basis of history.
We can go into, like, you and I talked on the phone earlier about NATO's contributions, and 18 out of the members are paying now, and but there's a diverse crowd here in this audience: older people, younger people, immigrants, non-immigrants, and they're being told right now by people, including General Petraeus, former General Petraeus, saying that this is the most dangerous time since World War II. These are people that lived through the Cold War, through Vietnam, through 9/11, and basically we have 3 major wars going on right now. We have the one pending.
We got
but
two. Hopefully not pending, but we have a major challenge from Russia, which is not just about Ukraine. It's about a country that has enormous military capabilities, despite all those dead soldiers, the nuclear weapons, the chemical weapons, the submarines, the cyber weapons, space, as we've heard a little bit about, and that's got a real grievance. We have the Middle East. We can talk about that, and we've got a China challenge,
and I'm gonna
which is huge.
And I'm going to end on that because the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Republican, said on Meet the Press about 2 months ago that they said, "What are we going to do about Taiwan?" And I get this question asked by me, and I said, "Do you want your son or daughter to die fighting for Taiwan?" And I haven't seen one American say yes. And I'm just going back to what you're saying is, the U.S. has to be involved in this. And I agree. A lot of the decisions and mistakes we made, those chickens have now come home to roost.
Yes.
But I was going to ask you this before, and we have other questions we're going to get to. But if we had a Madeleine Albright, if we had a Henry Kissinger, if we had a Bob Gates, if we had big American strong leaders, when Israel was attacked on October 6th. Or 7th. Somebody said if it was during Reagan's time, you would have had leaders that would be like, call up Mubarak in Egypt and say, we need to de-escalate the situation. I don't know, but I'd like to get into some of these questions. I mean, and I know I'm hitting you with a bomb before I want
to be fair, in exactly 50 years before the October 7th attack, we had another surprise attack on Israel which then nearly became a general Middle East war, right? And that was the Yom Kippur War. It was the 1973 war. It's going to be a dangerous world. That is something that we have to open our eyes to. The question is whether or not, as the United States, we recognize that we can, as still the most powerful country in the world, it's the most innovative country in the world, it's the country that everyone looks to, that we can shape that world for the better, or whether we pull back. So I always come back again to history. So think about the first half of the 20th century for a minute, okay? First half of the 20th century saw the two most devastating, destructive, deadly wars in human history. It saw the worst economic depression in human history, and it saw the near takeover of the planet by genocidal, dictatorial powers. That was the world when America was not involved. Okay? Now let's talk about the second half of the 20th century. The longest period of great power peace in centuries. The greatest economic expansion of wealth in human history. And the greatest expansion of democracy to parts of the planet where no one imagined it was possible before. That was the world of America leading, of America being engaged. Now, America, as we all know, can screw up in some very, very spectacular ways. And I don't think we have enough time tonight to begin to enumerate what some of those are. But I understand there are probably some pretty good bars around here, and so afterwards, we can talk about those. But in the absence of American leadership, in the absence of America trying, you're going to get that first half of the century. And let me just say one last thing.
I knew you'd bring us back to a more positive American light.
Well, I do though want to say how serious I think it is, so I do think this is more, the moment that we're in is more dangerous than the Cold War, and it's going to require exceptional leadership for us to get through it. And I'm not sure I see it on either side of the aisle right now, and that worries me. Here's why it's more dangerous, in my view. So, the Cold War, there were a lot of features in the Cold War that made the absence of hot war more likely than not. What were they? The first is that the borders of the Cold War, and the principal theater of the Cold War in Europe, were borders of mutual success. So mutual victory. So the United States and the Soviet Union won World War II. So the US had never been further east, and the Soviets had never been further west, except during the Napoleonic Wars, which Stalin pointed out. But the bottom line was that for both, that Iron Curtain, that division reflected a joint victory, right? And neither side absolutely had to change those borders. It wasn't imperative. When you look today in Europe, in Asia, these borders are not borders of mutual success or victory. From the Russian perspective, the borders are those of humiliation. 1991, Soviet collapse. And so they want to revise those borders. That's what we're looking at. When Xi Jinping looks out, he says, the borders that I see in Asia are the consequence of the period of 200 years of Chinese weakness. We're not weak anymore. It's time to start changing things. So we're dealing with much more aggressive revisionism on the parts of our adversaries than we had during the Cold War. That's one. Two, the principal weapon of the Cold War was the nuclear weapon. Now, nuclear weapons have a couple of features that were really important. The first is, it didn't require any imagination to know what a nuclear war was going to look like, because nuclear weapons were used at the end of World War II. So if you had any doubt about what it would look like if you had a nuclear war, you looked at Hiroshima and you looked at Nagasaki, and then you thought about New York and Washington and Moscow. And it was not very hard to say, okay, well, we don't want that. Okay. The weapons that are increasingly going to define this competition that we're in now are weapons that we've never seen get used at scale. So what does a cyber war look like at scale? What does artificial intelligence look like at scale in war? What does space look like when you go to war there at scale? How about biotechnology, synthetic bio? Any ideas? We can speculate, but we don't really know. So that's not good. It requires a lot more imagination to be able to realize, like, okay, what does this entail, and therefore maybe what we shouldn't bring down on ourselves. Lastly, so nuclear weapons, if you got one, are actually comparatively easy to hide, but their delivery vehicles are not. So, if you want to deliver a nuclear weapon, particularly lots of nuclear weapons, you either need a ballistic missile with a silo, or a submarine, or a bomber, and we can pick up all those things from orbit once you have satellites, right? And so nuclear weapons lent themselves to a kind of reciprocal arms control, because I can see how many bombers and how many subs and how many silos you've got, and you can do the same, and so therefore we can start to have a negotiation about, well, how many times over do we need to be able to blow up the planet? Is 20 enough? Maybe we can take it down to 15, right? And oh, by the way, in the event that you use any of these, there's no ambiguity about where they're coming from. If you use yours, I'm going to use mine, and the world's going to end. So we get deterrence, and we get arms control. That's the Cold War. What have we got now? So first, cyber, AI, space, synthetic bio, those things don't lend themselves to the kind of monitoring, verification, arms control that those nuclear delivery vehicles do. We don't know how to do that yet. And oh, by the way, a lot of those capabilities don't even exist in the hands of government, right? You ask, like, who's doing work in synthetic biology? It's private companies. Cyber, and go on and on. Two, we went through COVID, and we're still trying to figure out, right, debating, where did that come from? Verification and attribution when a cyber weapon gets used, when some of these other kinds of weapons might get used, is not nearly so straightforward. And so that deterrence is also not nearly as straightforward. So we're in a different period. And I think it is a more dangerous period for those structural reasons, not just because China is big and scary or Russia is big and scary, but because the nature of the world that we're dealing with is different from the Cold War. We got to figure this out. Now, the good news is we can figure it out. We got to, because this is for all the marbles. But it's going to require a great deal of creativity and courage and leadership. The good news is, on our side, we do have this thing also called democracy. So we get to choose. We get to decide who our leaders are going to be. And we get to say, well, this is important or that's important. Or we can watch reality TV. So at the end of the day, this is all ultimately a test of us. Whether we're going to live up to it, whether we're going to be clear-eyed about what this situation is or not. The future is going to depend on how we answer that question in a very, very profound way.
Thank you, Vance. Deep discussions on a lot of things. I want to hit some of these pictures.
We can also, do you want to just open it up? I mean, we can do pictures at some other point, because
okay.
I want to be respectful of people's time.
We got a gentleman
I'm sure that I'm sure I've hopefully offended at least half of the audience by now. So
you can take a water break too. It is water.
This is when we say, please remember to put your insult in the form of a question.
Hi, I have a question. So throughout the entire talk, we've been talking about getting Russia into a stalemate in Ukraine and what the future of the conflict may evolve into post-war, during war, whether this turns into some sort of forever war. We know from previous experience, whether it be Iraq, Afghanistan, or other places that, places that are destabilized from wider spread conflicts tend to be hotbeds for extremism, civil war, and all these other issues. Ukraine has all the issues of billions of dollars in property damage. I saw one very conservative estimate which places it in the hundreds of billions of dollars, not to mention all the unexploded ordnance that's throughout the entire country. Yeah. And you have 6 million people right now that are living as refugees abroad, and with global statistics, only 3% of them, if that falls, will ever return to Ukraine. And you also have the possibility of the Putin regime potentially collapsing, some sort of system that leads to Russia becoming a failed state, whether it be some sort of civil war where everyone senses blood in the water and goes to try to take over the region. And Russia, as you mentioned before, for your reasons in wanting to study it initially in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have the presence of nuclear weapons, which you might find people who are guarding nuclear missile silos, seeing the country collapsing around them, be like, I got to go protect my family, got to go protect my family, community, whatever the case may be, abandoning them, and even those who may be more diligent saying, well, without support, you have a lot of things that could potentially go wrong in this scenario. And basically, with both of these factors kind of leading to wider destabilization, how does the world actually win the peace after we've won the war?
It's a profound and terrific question, and you've clearly you thought about this deeply, and I commend the question. And you're absolutely right as well, that the question is not just about how do you prevail in war, it's also how do you prevail in peace? How do you create something that looks like long-term stability? So the first thing I will say is you don't get to figure out the second question unless you get the first one right? And so the first thing that we just have to recognize is I think that as long as Russia is on the march, as long as Putin believes that he is being successful, we don't have the opportunity to even begin to get at that question. Second is a lot's going to depend on what happens and the opportunities that then present themselves. I think that we got to also recognize that the opportunity for peace is something which is always fragile. So there's not going to be necessarily a magic formula that allows us to then do the end of history banner, right? But let's imagine for a minute the following, right? And this is the opposite of catastrophizing. This is trying to be realistic but ultimately hopeful. Let's imagine that the Ukrainians don't collapse. And let's imagine that we have a Ukraine which is able to go and, under the defense of American and Western and increasingly Ukrainian air defenses, continue to actually operate as a free society. And by the way, one of the things which was very striking for me during the visit, I had, on some level, I knew that this was wrong, but I still had this idea in my head that you're going to go to Ukraine and it's going to be like a war zone. You're going to be walking down the street and everything's going to be rubble and there are going to be missiles flying everywhere. And of course, that's actually not the case. It's a big country. Every day, the Russians are firing missiles in. But every day, most of those missiles are actually, and drones are getting shot down, they're getting intercepted, and Ukrainians are actually going on with their lives. Ukraine has a real economy, so they're exporting today as much grain, which is core to their economy, as they were before the war began. They're getting their steel production back as well. So they actually have the ability to, let's imagine in that kind of South Korea-like scenario, although they're under this incredible threat, they're able to hang on. They're actually able, behind this shield that we build together, become a successful society, which also means becoming more and more like the rest of the West. Rule of law, investment, all the things that make for a successful society, which, by the way, is what Ukrainians themselves want, right? Because they can look across the border into Poland, and they can see that a place which used to be under Russian dominion, under Russian control, has now become a very rich, very successful, very prosperous, and free society, for all that it, too, like all of us, has problems. What does that mean ultimately? So I think two things. One, the scenario that I said before about people inside the Russian regime who may not be our friends, who may actually have geopolitical ambitions that are every bit as sprawling as Putin's, but who can begin to say, you know, I'm not sure that direct confrontation, head-on collision with American power is such a good idea. And oh, by the way, you know, we can't help but notice that at the same time that we've been in this fight with the Americans, the Chinese are eating our lunch in Siberia and the Far East. So maybe we need to have a more balanced approach. Maybe instead of having kind of permanent hostility with the West, we need to be a little bit more of an equilibrium where we cultivate a closer relationship with the West. At the same time, we play the West and China off of each other. Is that conceivable? Yeah, I think that that's conceivable. Now, is that, you know, Russia becoming a Jeffersonian democracy? No. Is that a Russia which looks very different from Vladimir Putin's Russia, one where they're in permanent confrontation with us? Yes. Again, I find history to be helpful sometimes. So if you think back to the 1990s, remember the Balkans? And we had Slobodan Milosevic, who was the dictator in Serbia, who tried to take over all of the Western Balkans and tried to take Bosnia and tried to take parts of Croatia and did ethnic cleansing and this idea of Greater Serbia, a little bit like Greater Russia. And ultimately, he bet that, you know, the Americans, the Europeans are never going to get their act together, so I can get away with all this stuff. And for a while, he was right, until he wasn't. And then there was intervention, and there was bombing, and ultimately, his own security services, in the face of an uprising, decided that they were not going to stand with him. And so he's gone now. Now, Serbia is not part of NATO. It's not part of the EU. And if you talk to their leadership, these are folks who, the current president of Serbia was the information minister under Milosevic. But he will also say, we're out of that game, because the direct confrontation did not work. It was a disaster for us. So we're going to have good relations with everyone, with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the Israelis, with the Emiratis. And you know what? Is that end of history territory? No. Is that a lot better than a Serbia which is invading its neighbors and slaughtering people on the basis of ethnicity and causing us to have to get into a war in the Balkans and to send troops there as peacekeepers? Yes. So Russia is always going to be different. I think that we're always, I say to people, it's always a good idea to study Russian because Russia is always going to be geopolitically interesting. But I don't think that this is necessarily what we're always going to be stuck with. But it's got to begin with us drawing some lines and then backing them with power, in my view. And by the way, if Russia moves in that direction, I think that, you know, the West has a track record of being incredibly generous towards countries that decide that they want to come in out of the cold. So there is that path for Russia. We probably also need to be doing, once we get closer to that point, diplomacy that makes clear there is an off-ramp. My fear when people say, well, why shouldn't we do that right now, is that as long as Putin believes he could win on the battlefield, as long as he thinks that there's a pathway where American political support for Ukraine collapses, where we just throw them to the wolves, I don't think that he's likely to be negotiating anything. I don't think that people within the regime are also likely to turn against him because they're going to say, hey, the old man, he looks like he might have been right all along. That's what we got to first deal with. I hope that
Thank
that
you.
was helpful.
Yeah, that very much answers my question. Do you mind if I ask one small little question to piggyback on that?
Just a quick answer, quick question, because I know
Yeah,
we got a lot going.
as you can see, I'm really good at the short answers.
We got a lot of we have a lot of questions, but yes.
Yeah, sure. If you want me to pass it along, I can pass
Go,
it on.
go, you can go ahead. It's fine.
So one of the main concerns in the news that has been popping up with Ukraine, as you were talking about, actually winning the war before we can have the opportunity to win the peace, is Ukrainian manpower. All the weapon systems in the world aren't useful if there's no one behind to push the button, pull the lever, pull the trigger. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's not a short question. That's a big question. So yeah, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, but they're also running out of people. So they're going to need to do a mobilization, and that's going to be very, very difficult and very painful. And there is political turmoil inside Ukraine as well. As many of you probably have seen, President Zelensky made the decision to remove the top military commander, General Zaluzhny. He put in a new commander. I will tell you, and again, I in the spirit of being transparent, I think that there's a lot that we can and must do, and if we don't provide them with weapons, they're, in my view, I think that they're cooked in the near term. But even if we do that, there are still meaningful risks. The manpower is a real challenge. The internal politics are also getting very, very tricky in Ukraine. I hope that the severity of the threat, the external threat, will keep them from unraveling, and ultimately will also give them the path that they need to do the mobilization. But it's going to be tough. It is going to be tough. Now, having defensive lines is also easier to sustain than if you're going on the offensive. One of the other challenges, though, that the Ukrainians have is that they have not yet put in the kinds of defensive lines around their positions that I believe that they need to do urgently in order to try to thwart Russian breakthroughs, Russian advances. And unfortunately, just since December 1st, if you look at the next slide, Steve, you can see how all across eastern Ukraine, we have begun to have places where the Russian forces have been able to break through. Most recently, last weekend, the fall of Avdiivka. And there's a real risk that between the failure to provide weapons right now, so they are very constrained, the exhaustion of the forces that are out there who have not been rotated out now for 2 years, the political turmoil, that we could end up with further meaningful collapses. If you look, there's a city called Robotyne, which is in the south. The Russians are making a real push
You want me to keep going
there right now. No, we don't have to do that.
Okay.
Why don't we take some more questions?
All right. Gentleman up there with a hat, and Vance, I might cut you off to make quicker answers, quicker questions.
I was
I
going
got
to
about
say,
4 people
we
that
have
have
a
their hands up.
democracy in this country, but
Yeah.
on stage, you're the
Not
boss.
here, yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here. You alluded to one of them. In the recent, I would say, week and 24 hours, there was talk about Russians in space with missiles. I would assume missiles in space would be aimed towards communication, satellites, GPS technology. And I believe it was this morning there was actual video of Putin second-sharing a bomber plane with the ability to carry 12 nuclear-capable missiles. Do you see this as, with range of, I think it was 7,500 miles?
Yeah.
See these as direct threats against NATO, if not the U.S. directly?
Yeah, they're definitely direct threats against the U.S. But to be fair, the Soviet Union and then Russia, have developed a doomsday complex, right, of submarines, bombers, and intercontinental ballistic missiles to be able to saturate the United States and Europe with nuclear weapons. So we've had that capability for a while. They've had that capability for a while. There's a balance of terror between us. They are modernizing, and they have modernized a lot of their capabilities. We have also modernized a lot of ours. What was publicly reported with respect to space was something which is, if it is accurate, would be new. So again, strictly repeating what has been reported in the press and not commenting on whether or not it is or is not accurate, I don't know. There's a 1967 treaty that Russia is signatory to, which bans the placement of weapons of mass destruction in space. What has been publicly reported is that the possibility that Russia is considering putting a nuclear weapon in orbit. The idea here would be that if such a weapon were used, it would disrupt and destroy the satellite constellations that all of us rely on for communication, for GPS, for all of our functioning of the world economy and our daily lives, as well as military purposes, which is heavily reliant on space. So that would be something which would be new. Putin publicly came out and said, this is nonsense, we would not do this. This is just further American disinformation. Let's see. I will say that, again, just speculating, the question, and this is again just repeating what's been reported, I think that the speculation is that if such a weapon were deployed, it would not necessarily be to be used, but as, again, an additional kind of threat, another sword of Damocles hanging over us, over the world economy. But as the administration also reportedly quickly pointed out, it would also threaten other people's satellites, including China and
allies.
India.
Yep.
Correct.
Thank you. Let's move over here. Yes, sir. Okay. Brave. Not you, Joe, the other guy behind. Yep, with the flannel on. Sorry. Oh, okay.
Vance, in the book 2034, China places nuclear bombs on the cities Galveston and San Diego. Meanwhile, we retaliate by wiping out Shanghai with a nuclear weapon. Meanwhile, Russia's licking its chops to find out, while we're distracted, what additional geography he can acquire. The Indian Navy steps in and calls timeout. How close are we to this scenario now?
I think it's a terrific novel. And I think it's a terrific novel because it helps us to imagine catastrophic possibilities, which in turn then should help us think, how do we avoid these things, right? How do we avoid a world where there's a nuclear exchange between the United States and China, right? I'm a big believer in Cold Wars. I prefer Cold Wars to hot wars. And so that causes you to then say, well, how do we have deterrence? How do we ensure that we build up enough capability, enough military capability, that governments, leaders who might have revisionist ambitions conclude this is not worth it. This is too dangerous. I can't get away with this. I believe that we still have some runway ahead of us. And by the way, in the event that Putin is viewed as having failed in Ukraine, I do believe that what's happening in Ukraine is being followed very closely by our friends in Beijing, both in terms of the tactical and military lessons that they're drawing, what to do, what not to do, technologies, but also this deeper question of, okay, if he can get away with it, that sends one signal. If he can't, that's another. But most important of all, again, my view is, have we developed, are we investing in the hard power capabilities so that when Xi Jinping is looking across the Taiwan Strait, Vladimir Putin is looking beyond Ukraine, his conclusion in each case is to say, this doesn't look like such a good idea. I'm not sure that I can get away with this. I got to keep working at this.
Thank you, Vance. Thank you. Joe, and then we got a gentleman up on the top. Yeah.
You know, I mean, real fast. The issue of blood in the water, Afghanistan, like Steve said before.
Yeah.
You've got Middle East players, the Chinese, all moving at the same time after we dumped Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, peace through strength, I think, has always been important. I don't think anybody sees that now. If you look at our president, he's feeble and not decisive. And there are a lot of issues there. But peace through strength, and there is blood in the water. And I think they all smell it.
So here's the only thing I guess I'd say. One of the things that I think we all naturally do as Americans is that, and I certainly hear our politicians do this on both sides, is that they'll say, you know, we need to be strong. And being strong is having tough rhetoric, it's, you know, looking a certain way, it's talking a certain way, or it's solidarity with allies instead of picking fights with allies. There are variations of this on both sides. And by the way, I don't disagree with some of these critiques. But what I think matters far more is something which is a lot harder, which is what are the actual military capabilities that we got? Is the balance of power, the hard balance of power, stable? Is it moving in our direction, or is it moving in the other guy's direction? I would suggest that the big challenge that we've got right now is over the last 20 years, under presidents of both parties, that military balance has moved away from us, right? So, you know, we can talk about this is that guy's fault, and this is this guy's fault, or this is the Democrats, or this is the Republicans, and this is, you know, and by the way, the folks on each side will tell you 100% it is the other guy's fault, right? That's, strangely enough, I've never heard anyone say, you know, this really, we really need to take some responsibility for this. It's always, strangely enough, you know, the other guy, like, he really has made a mess of this. This is a bipartisan failure, if we're going to be very honest, right? And I worked on the Senate for 6 years, and I can tell you, and we can have a longer conversation about why we allowed our military edge to erode. Some of it has been that the other guys have innovated, right? And that we had a really successful model. We'll call it the Blockbuster video model. You guys all remember Blockbuster? It was a great model. The only problem is that if the other guy comes along with Netflix, you got a problem, right? And unless you're going to start saying, okay, well, you know, we need to maybe get rid of some of these brick and mortar, maybe we need to develop streaming, you're going to have a problem. So this is something which is played out, and there's a lot of responsibility to go around for it. We have a pathway to innovate too. And in fact, our society is better at innovation than anywhere else. And we attract the best people from all over the world because this is where the innovation happens. But we got to get our act together. And that's not just about spending more money, although I think that's part of it. It's also spending on different things. It's making tough choices. But if we don't get that military balance different, and again, we haven't, under presidents of both parties, Congresses of both parties, no amount of rhetoric, no amount of how do you look on the stage, how do you sound, is going to, in my view, allow us to escape the problem that we're heading in. And this is a preview of the future, which is dictators saying, I can get away with it because the balance of power is in my favor, or ambiguous enough that they decide, I'm going to roll the dice. That's what we got to deal with.
Thank you. We have a gentleman in the back with the hat on, and then Taylor will end with you. Okay.
I don't need the microphone, sir. I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing very chilling parallels between Germany in the middle to late 30s and what's going on today.
Yeah.
We took Crimea. Nobody did anything. Hitler took Sudetenland. Nobody did anything, and he ended up owning almost all of Western Europe.
Yeah.
We got forced into both World War I and World War II, and we're always late coming to the game. I think we're going to get forced into this. Do you think if we come late to the game to this, that the outcome will be a good one?
So the argument that you're making is very favorable to the argument that I'm making. I'm still always going to be careful about drawing the historical parallel to the 30s, because in a way it sort of shuts down the debate, right? Because we all know where that goes, right? And so I do believe that one of the wider lessons of history is that when you don't confront an aggressor, you invite more aggression. I also think that one of the patterns of history is that Americans often oscillate. We go back and forth between periods when we have a kind of crusading zeal, and then we become disillusioned and we pull back, right? And so why were we that way in the 1930s? Part of the reason we were that way in the 1930s is because of our intervention in World War I, which was, which did not turn out to be the war that ended all wars, right? You think about how we began the Cold War, and then came Vietnam, and the pullback, and the, oh my gosh, America's a terrible place, and we can't do anything right, and therefore we shouldn't get involved in the world, and then we end up with a giant mess in the 1970s, right, where it suddenly looks like we're losing the Cold War. So finding balance is tough. It's not something that we as Americans, I think, are probably naturally inclined to do. In this particular case, look, we are coming, you mentioned it before, and we got to be honest about this. I don't think anyone looks back at Iraq and Afghanistan and says, well, that was terrific. That really fills me with confidence about our capacity to do things in the world. And people like me, who are national security people, have to own that, right? And so when people are skeptical and they say, well, we spent all this money and what did it get us? We can have that conversation. But that's, I think, part of what's also feeding into this. My plea is, though, ultimately the same as yours, which is when America pulls back, what fills the vacuum are things that ultimately prove to be very, very harmful to our interests, our values, our security. I think that has been a recurring constant of history, and that I think we forget that, as we're often inclined to do, at our peril. I hope that in this case we don't, and I don't think it's too late. I think that we still have a lot of runway ahead, but this is one of those key moments. Like either the Congress is going to pass this thing or they're not. It's binary. Either they're going to say we can't figure out a political path to get it, or they do. So this is one of those moments where all of our voices actually do count for something.
Taylor?
Yeah, so my question is, listening to this, nothing about this conversation is positive to me.
Yeah.
Just reality.
Yeah.
That's why there's not a lot of kids in the audience.
But the part of here that disturbs me is, are we looking at World War III? Because you're dealing with somebody who's insane, that has his finger on a button that doesn't care if he blows up the world. When does America say, like they did in World War II with Germany, we're going in? Because if we don't go in, and he does take over Ukraine like you say he's going to, what is next, and then when do we go in?
So a couple of things, and then I think it's the wrong conclusion to come away from this and say, oh my God, this is all hopeless, right? Let's talk about the world that we're in right now. So we're in a world where we have this country, Ukraine, where these people are fighting and dying because they want to be part of our club. And what's our club? Our club is being part of this thing called the free world. They want democracy, they want rule of law, they want all the freedoms that don't exist in Russia, right? Walk across Europe today. If we were having this conversation 30, 40 years ago, Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states would all be under Soviet rule. And if you had said to someone in 1980, you know, I'm going to imagine a future where one of America's closest allies in the world is going to be a democratic Poland, which spends on defense as a percentage of GDP more than the United States does, buying American weapons. People would say, you know, I don't know what you've been smoking, but you know, the 70s are over and you probably should stop, right? That's the world that we're in right now. And you go to a place like Poland, or you go to Estonia, you go to Latvia, you go to Lithuania, and what do you see? You see something really powerful, something that I think we sometimes forget because we see all the problems. And by the way, we know that the problems are real, and we can talk about them, problems that, Steve, you deal with every day, right? All the challenges within the free world, all the challenges that we're confronting that are real. But what you also see when you go to these places and you talk to people who were there in 1980 and 1985 is that freedom works. That this thing called Western civilization actually is better. It is superior to the despotism of a dictator. It is better than the dysfunction of communism. It is better. And as a result, these places, which were on the other side of the line, are now on our side. And they're saying, we're going to do whatever it takes to keep America as an ally and in NATO. We're going to do whatever it takes to hold the line against the Russians and Putin. And by the way, it's not just there. You know, you go all across Asia, and you go to a place like Japan. Japan last year announced that they were going to double their spending on defense. Why? For two reasons. One, they said, you know, it's a dangerous world and we got to work on deterrence. But two, we want to be a better ally to the United States, and we believe that this alliance is so important to us. You go to Korea, a place which 50, 60 years ago was impoverished. It was Ukraine. Half of it had been taken over, right? Half of it is North Korea, the most despotic, and it made the bid to try to take over all of it, and they got pushed back, and we weren't able to win the war, just divided in half. Today, this is a place which is a technology superpower. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, you name it, and they're part of our team. And they're giving weapons to the Europeans. They're on our side for all of this. So here's the thing. It's a dangerous world. We've got some really nasty people who are in positions that we would wish that they would not be in. We've been talking about one of them this evening. But we should also recognize that if you look at the world from their perspective for a minute, our position is not so bad because we have a bunch of things that they don't have. We have a set of values which are incredibly powerful and that actually translate into incredible success. We have technologies that they don't have. We have innovation they don't have. By the way, we have something else, which is that anyone from any part of the world can come here and become American. Do you see that happening in Russia or China? I don't think so. So, you know, we got these huge challenges. The dangers are very, very real. The dangers, in my view, are worse because for a period of time, we've not been willing to open our eyes to them, and because we thought we were safe, and so we could be silly. And we could be frivolous. And maybe we also, I would even go so far as to say, occasionally elected people on perhaps both sides of the aisle who might not be the most serious people or who might not be as focused on these things. But the capabilities that we've got as a society are spectacular. And our potential for leadership, which you also see throughout our history when things finally get serious, when Americans realize that this is no joke, I think that we should draw some hope and some inspiration from that. So I hope you don't come out of here feeling like, oh my gosh, this is all hopeless. All it requires is us to remember who we actually are, to get serious again, and to remember our own best history.
Stop it. I mean, you have a man who's got his finger on something that can blow the room. Obviously, he's not saying.
Yeah, so here's the short answer for that. Putin, from everything that we've seen, is not suicidal. He's a bully. When he sees opportunity, he will move. When he encounters real strength, it's a different story. So every day, right, for the last 2 years, US and allies have been flying planes into Poland, unloading those planes full of weapons, and then they move from Poland into Ukraine. Why hasn't he attacked that airport? Why hasn't he attacked those planes? The answer is because he doesn't want to pick a fight with NATO, because he doesn't want to pick a fight with the United States. He's prepared to pick a fight in Ukraine because he thought that Ukraine was going to be a pushover. Because everything that we'd done over 20 years convinced him, I can get away with this, and these guys are not going to do anything to stop me. So I don't think that the response to a bully, the response to someone like this is not to be afraid. Right? It's to be strong, it's to be firm, and it's not to allow them to intimidate you with a madman act or anything else. Everything we've seen suggests this guy's not suicidal, he's opportunistic. Let's not give him the opportunity. Then we'll be safe.
I just want to go through some of these pictures real quick.
Oh,
I'm going
sure.
to fly through them. I'm going to give you like 10 seconds for each
Okay.
one. Okay?
Yeah, so one of the things that you've heard me talk about is just the incredible savagery that you see in Ukraine. So this is in a neighborhood just outside of Kharkiv, that city in the northeast. This is just a residential complex.
Which
So-
could look like one back here in the United States.
Yeah, and basically there's no military target anywhere near here, and what the Russian forces have been doing is that they will randomly lob cruise missiles, anti-aircraft missiles into the apartment blocks here. So we spent some time walking around talking to people. You can see both where there's been a strike. You can also see how there's cardboard on most of the windows because the windows get blown out by the blast. But I'll also say this, the Ukrainians are rebuilding anything that can be rebuilt as quickly as the Russians are trying to smash it. And remember, because the Ukrainians have anti-aircraft defenses, systems we've given them, they're able to try to shoot down many of these things, protecting their own people. And that's one of the things which is at stake. Okay, so this is the kind of devastation we're talking about. This is in a different city. This is in a place called Dnipro. And in this case, a missile got through. There was, you can see, an apartment building on the left, on the right, and the missile just collapsed the center of this building. So the people who were in it obviously were tragically killed. But you see the kind of devastation that this is inflicted. If you go back one.
Sorry about that, buddy.
Yeah, no worries. So this is, you can see on the side of the building how this blast just sheared the side of the building off, and you're looking inside people's apartments, and their personal effects are in many cases still there. You see the closet, the kitchen, but the nature of this was that it was just a sheer force of the missile ripping the side of the building off. So this is something really pretty remarkable. So one thing that the Ukrainians have not been able to do is send their kids back to school. So the fear is that if you send kids to school, there could be a missile strike, a drone strike, and that thought is just so horrible, so that kids are overwhelmingly going to school online, which we all went through some version of this during COVID. Just imagine if you are coming out of COVID and then you have to keep doing it, right? With all the problems that our kids went through. In Kharkiv, one way that they're trying to deal with this, though, is that they've put schools into the subway system. So this is a school which is they've put into the metro. The difficulty is you can only have so many kids down in there. The need is vastly greater than the space. They're now trying to construct additional schools underground so that kids will be someplace safe. We spent some time in the classroom. I've never seen 7-year-olds happier to be in a classroom. I also asked, what do they want to be when they grow up? And almost everyone said that they wanted to be a mathematician, which made me want to encourage them all to move to the United States when they grow up, because we certainly could use more of those. But just really striking the resilience. Okay, I talked about how you have this image of Ukraine as being nothing but a war zone, but actually a lot of the country is still functioning. This is on a train from Kharkiv to Kyiv, so from that city in the east, second biggest city, to the capital. As you can see, it's actually a very modern train. Train is full, and life is going on. One thing I will say, and I think, Steve, I mentioned this to you, in Ukraine right now, everyone has an app, and that app basically is an air defense app. So you tell it where you are, and in the event that there is a Russian air activity or an assessment that there's an incoming missile, and because of the distances involved, it usually is 10, 15, 20 minutes, you get an alert, and it says, danger, there's the risk of an incoming missile. The person who provides the voice for this is Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker.
Oh, wow.
And when the alert is over, Mark Hamill, then his voice appears on your phone and says, "The danger is past. May the force be with you." Which I will definitely say was definitely the weirdest experience I've ever had in a war zone. But it's good to know that
It's similar like an earthquake warning in Japan.
Well,
on your app.
It feels appropriate that Luke Skywalker is on the side of the Ukrainians, and that he's once again standing up to the dark side of the Force.
This obviously looks a little bit.
Yeah. So this is this place that I mentioned, Bucha. This is the field where they found the 200 plus bodies, which is now a memorial, and the names of everyone that they've been able to identify. There are some that they've not yet been able to identify are on this plaque. So a very, very somber place. Last picture. This is just in downtown Kyiv, and again, to give you a sense that amidst all of the horrors of this war, you have a country which is functional. That the restaurants and the cafes and the shops are open, that people are working. You don't see nearly so many young men for obvious reasons, but that this is not a hopeless cause. What you're looking at is what the shield of defense that we've provided for the last 2 years affords, which is that behind that shield, which does not provide perfect security, but provides a lot of security. And behind the Ukrainian forces that have been fighting and sacrificing themselves is a functional, free society that, to my mind, seeing close up, makes you realize that this is something which is worth defending, which is worth supporting.
Vance, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out here tonight. Appreciate it, buddy.
Thanks for having me.
This is great. Thank you guys for joining us. We're going to probably have our next one in April. I'm going to be doing some traveling myself. I think you are too over next month. But I appreciate everybody coming out. It's important stuff affecting our country, our community. We have a huge Ukrainian community in Orange County. And obviously, we have a lot of service members that are serving overseas right now.
Look, I mean, this is the sort of thing, I'm so grateful to you, Steve. I think there's sometimes a sense that these national security foreign policy questions, they're supposed to be decided and discussed in Washington, far away. But two things. One, this actually does affect all of us, right? We are talking about war and peace. We're talking about what kind of country we want to be. And two, we do get a voice, right? There's a debate which is taking place right now in Washington. All of us, as citizens, we are the ones who ultimately get a say. And whatever you come away from this discussion thinking, agreeing with me, thinking that you completely disagree with me and that you're persuaded in the opposite direction, foreign policy requires us not to simply leave things in the hands of people in Washington. It requires an informed citizenry. It requires us to have views, and it requires us to speak up and tell our leaders what you think. So thank you so much for facilitating this.
Thank you, buddy. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys.